50 years ago this week, at the height of the Cold War, the Russians started building missiles on the island of Cuba. The Americans reacted, and for a few weeks the whole world was on the brink of nuclear war. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, if World War III had begun, it may have started not in Cuba, but in Lincolnshire. Keely Donovan has the story on the preparation to launch Britain's bombs.
It's a summer's day at RAF Waddington, and the crowds are out for the station's annual aviation showcase.
Back in October 1962, it was home to the Vulcan bombers of the RAF's V-Force. Today, it's hosting the Waddington Air Show.
But we'd have none of this if events 50 years ago this month had taken a different turn.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the nearest we ever got to starting World War III. Russia had placed nuclear weapons in Cuba and aimed them at America, and they weren't scared off by the Americans setting up a blockade. There seemed only one conclusion.
We were potentially minutes away from nuclear war, and the first bomb of this terrible conflict could have been launched not from Cuba, but from here in Lincolnshire.
In 1962, if we'd launched a nuclear bomb towards Russia, the weapon would have begun its journey in the east of England.
Lincolnshire was very important for deterrent purposes in the Cold War, and of course the V-bombers carried the nuclear weapon, and you also had the Thor missile complexes that were deployed from about 1958 onwards. Of course, towards the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was getting very hot.
A group of aviation historians in Lincolnshire collecting first-hand accounts of the Cuba crisis are finding that some of them don't quite match the version on file.
We found out that in the official record that Bomber Command were put up to alert condition 3 at 1 o'clock on the Saturday afternoon. But talking to people, they say, well, they can remember on the Thursday prior, things were already happening on the station.
Attention, attention. All personnel take first for countdown.
It doesn't quite tally that some of the timeline seems to not accord to the official version.
So the records say we went on alert on Saturday, but did we actually do this much earlier? We've come to another old airfield, Newark, looking for aircrew who were on duty that week in 1962. We're at a reunion of the V-Force, the men who crewed the Vulcans, Victors and Valiants that carried the bomb, and who can remember being called in from the Thursday onwards.
We were watching television. Shadow across the window, knock on the door, and it was the village policeman. And he was sent by Waddington to hoist me out, told me to go to work. And I said, "What for, Constable?" He said, and I can't emulate the Lincolnshire accent, he said, "Well, if you don't know, sir, I can't tell you."
The ground crew were generating aeroplanes as fast as they could, loading a weapon onto them, and we gradually built from that one aeroplane, I think, to 7 by the Saturday.
I very quickly got dressed in uniform, kissed my wife and said, "If you hear us take off, you go. Take the kids and go." And then I left.
The UK official accounts say Saturday, but American records show that 2 days earlier, American ballistic missiles were being made ready on RAF bases in the east of England. This was once RAF Harrington in Northamptonshire. Here and Caister in Lincolnshire are the only places in the UK where there are visible remains of the Thor nuclear missiles.
There were 3 launch pads here. This is one of them. These huge blast walls protected the equipment and the personnel from the actual launch. Down here on this sort of concrete pad, there was a hangar which ran on rails. When the missile was at rest, as it were, it lay in that hangar.
It's an American product manned and maintained in this country by the Royal Air Force. The RAF controls the firing, but Thor cannot be blasted off without the agreement of both the British and United States governments.
This was a line of first defence for America, indeed one of the only ways at that stage that they could target missiles on Soviet Russia. It made us here very vulnerable.
Because Thor was jointly controlled by Britain and America, when America went on alert, so did we.
Kennedy ordered the Strategic Air Command to what was called DEFCON 3, which was 2 stages below war. And this was without knowledge of the British public.
To Admiralty House, the Prime Minister called his cabinet. Britain was not consulted by President Kennedy, but neither the ministers nor the Premier would let that stand in the way of statesmanlike assessment of the crisis. They quickly endorsed the President's action.
By the Saturday, 2 days on, it was deadlock between the Americans and Russians, and we officially went on alert. Unbeknown to the general public, throughout the east of England, Thor missiles and V-bomber crews were waiting, weapons loaded, ready to launch at 5 minutes' notice.
Attention, attention. This is the bomber controller. Alert Alpha Blue.
Every time the station tannoy went, you'd twitch a bit because the tannoy would click. You know, attention, attention. This is the bomber controller for bomb list Alpha.
We had studied our targets. We knew what we had to do. We knew that if we did have to scramble, if we did have to go to war, the politicians would have lost control of the situation.
I had really joined the Air Force to fly, and I wanted to be in the Red Arrows and all that sort of thing. And there I was in the wind and rain, actually arming a nuclear weapon, which was slightly different.
We were sitting there quietly chatting, and my dear friend Paul, who was the nav radar, that's the bomb aimer in a V-bomber, Paul suddenly got up and ambled over towards the aircraft, pulled a Chinograph pencil out of his flying suit pocket and did a CND badge on the side of the bomb. And when he came back, I said, "For God's sake, well, what did you do that for?" Or words to that effect. And he said, "If we have to drop that bugger, those b****s are right."
The CND members were declaring that nothing short of abolishing nuclear arms could prevent another world war.
British people were worried about the crisis in Cuba, but still had been told nothing of how war preparations were being made nearer home. This was a deliberate ploy by the Prime Minister.
Macmillan was concerned that any overt mobilisation might itself lead to war. He was very concerned that the British public didn't panic, and therefore, although the UK was demonstrably very, very vulnerable at this point, I think Macmillan felt that he wanted to try and keep the country on the sidelines, whereas in fact many people would have thought that it really was in the front line.
And do you think Macmillan got it right?
Well, I suppose in the event he could argue that he did, but had things gone desperately wrong, I'm not sure that those people who remained alive of the British public would have thanked him for it.
In the event, Macmillan's gamble worked. The Russian ships were turned back and normal Cold War relations were resumed between the two superpowers.
When we heard that the Soviet ships had stopped and then turned back, there was a very big sigh of relief because the tension had really built up to a great big peak, but we really didn't know what was going to happen. Neither did the rest of the world, really.
After the Cuba crisis, we rewrote the UK war books. The Thor sites were already earmarked for closure, and the V-Force carried a nuclear deterrent for a few more years, but never again were they brought back to the same level of alert.
But it's the first-hand accounts of these men that will remind us just how close we came to war.
Look at that, isn't that fantastic?